We, the members of the secret order of alchemical actors, do solemnly commit ourselves to a full and honest telling of the history of the occult as far as we know it.
So, Luke, I'm going to start this off a little bit different because I don't think we talk about how interviews come together. I don't know if we've ever talked about how interviews come together on the show. Have we?
Not that I can recall.
So there is, in my opinion, two ways that we get about doing an interview. The first way is somebody reaches out to us, like their publicist or their publisher or some fancy whatnot. And the other way is, that's all good, by the way. That's fine. I'm fine with that. We like those folks, authors and what have you. But the other way is, and this is sort of like a dicier way that we do this, I go to Luke and I'm like, hey, I would love to talk to this person. And then Luke goes and tries to get him. But today's guest, I can actually reach out to on Instagram, and I did. And I want to say about today's guest, and I hope she could stand hearing this, is I really enjoy what our guest does. She's got a really cool passion project that I've enjoyed keeping track of since we connected on the old Instagrams. And I think she's going to bring us some really cool insight today into the world of occultism and popular culture and witchcraft. So, Luke, without further ado, let us know who we're talking to.
Well, today joining us, we have Alyce Spencer from Perth, Australia, who is the founder of Witchway, the YouTube channel where she explores all manner of witchcraft as appearing in pop culture and identifying the lore that exists behind it.
Hi.
What's up?
Hello.
I'm so happy to be here. I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller.
Boy, could you imagine if people could call in, Luke? What a show that would be.
I don't know if I would be terrified or just terrified.
Would limit some of the negative comments, I think, as people could just yell at me right live on the show.
No, maybe we'll do a telethon.
So, Luke, what of Alyce's does any of her videos spring to mind for you? What do you like best?
I'm going to just go for a category, if that makes sense.
Or what have you watched recently?
Something that I think is probably, for lack of better terms, is one of the easiest ways for like someone who's new to any sort of occultism or even interested in witchcraft is looking at it from like the lens of popular culture. So when you do like breakdowns of like, Hocus Pocus or Sabrina or something like that, I think that's kind of what drew me in, because especially, growing up watching things and not having any sort of thoughts behind them as of like where this actually came from is super exciting. And that's kind of what we want to talk to you about today. Rob, I'll flip the question to you. What's something that comes to mind?
I just watched the Craft episode before we got in, which I had never apparently watched on your channel. Alyce is apparently one of your favorites, this movie, but I think I'm interested just to get into the topic with you. How do you like thinking about like Sabrina, right? How do you do this? Because Sabrina's an enormous show, right? It's like hours and hours and hours of entertainment.
Yes, the series are the really tricky ones because they do take hours to make my way through seasons and seasons. Sabrina, I think, has 8, so I did have to break that down into a two-parter there. But I really love the idea of witches in media, and they can be portrayed in so many different ways. And I noticed a trend in my likes of these films that majority of them had witches in them. And when I went looking for more, all I found was the same top 10 movies about witches. And I was thinking, surely there's more out there. And when I looked, there definitely is. My watch list, I think, has over 1,500 films and series involving witches.
Wow.
So us asking you for your top 10 is probably much more challenging.
Oh, yeah. I mean, some definitely stand above the rest. And some of them, while being good, I can't actually create much content out of them because they're based off pure fantasy. So I just really enjoyed, hearing about the history of witches as well. That's something that made me even more interested in the topic, and then seeing how that comes from history and onto the screen, it's portrayed in so many different ways.
So you watch, like, let's just say Harry Potter. Like that's a nice little in-between. It's not quite The Craft where you get done in 2 hours, but it's not quite Sabrina where you get done in 2 days.
Oh, yeah.
So you watch the Harry Potter series. How do you pick out, these little details? Because, for people who haven't seen Alyce's show, what she does is she picks out these details of the show that touch in with occultism. Some of them are very small, and she says, look, this is all the lore behind this one book on this shelf. What's your process being able to do that?
Well, it's been a big learning process for me. Some things I even look back on now and go, oh, I didn't even see this connection until I've made it a bit later on. There's the ones like Salem that's brought up in almost everything. It gets a little bit tiring because it was this one witch trial that has become so popularized, and I know it's still a lot, but it was only 19 people, and there are so many more in Europe that had just many, many more people, but it's this Salem one that just gets hyped up so much. And it wasn't even the first witch trial in the colonies, so trying to find all of these little bits. And you mentioned Harry Potter. That was one that I did find even the smallest detail in. I think it was Culpepper and was Mulpepper. He was a herbalist, and that was the name of the herbalist shop. So I just am fascinated by these small details that they include that have been inspired by this lore or history. And again, it's a bit of a learning process. I pick up more and more each time. The more it's almost like backwards studying. So the people who have created the show have done all the research and then put it into the show, and then I kind of pick the bits out and go back to the source material. So I guess that's a little bit of how my process works.
It's like reverse engineering. You're taking a finished product, breaking it down, and figuring out how all the components work that created the finished product in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's a bit of inspiration into it. I mean, your Bed Knobs and Broomsticks, which no one will be surprised, was one of my favorite movies as a child. But that you're like, you zero in on the opening credits. Like of course, it looks like the old medieval books, and oddly, there are a lot of connections in those opening credits, but who knew? Disney took the trouble.
And in the fact that they include the, I think it was the seal of Astaroth as their sigil. Yes.
Yeah, so tell us about witches in pop culture. I mean, you said about Salem. I mean, my opinion on Salem is that it was like the last major witch trial. It was sort of out of time. It had happened after the witch trial panic. So I think our obsession with Salem has something to do with that.
Yes.
But tell us a bit about witches in popular culture and where we've been and where we're going.
Well, yeah, there are definitely some trends going all the way back to early cinema. One of my more recent videos is on Hexen, considered the first documentary almost on witches, and that was from 1922. And that one took a lot of inspiration from the Malleus Maleficarum, so the Witch Hunter's Guide, and a lot of films go back and reference that almost as if it was the only one ever written on the subject. And I've discovered plenty more, and even many of the sources on Hexen say it was inspired by the Malleus Maleficarum, but there was even excerpts from the Compendium Maleficarum, another one that was written, I think, a couple of centuries later. So that kind of portrayal of witches is, the association with the devil and their pacts that give them these abilities, and they will use these for harm. And I think maleficia is the word that they used for black magic. That kind of witch has been there from the very beginning, and definitely one that has been used the most, I think, in Hollywood, in the portrayal of witches. I was surprised to see, though, that there were so many that took those devil worshipping witches and actually portrayed the trials of these real people in a real way, that they weren't witches, that they were just scapegoats of people's fear or jealousy even. So that's one that has definitely been used a lot in different films over many, like over 100 years now since Hexen came out. And so I'm sure you're well aware of the devil worshipping witch. Another one that comes up is, and it's from the fairy tales. You know, it's always the evil old woman who's luring children into the forest. You've got Snow White with the evil queen using witchcraft against this younger person. You've got the Little Mermaid with the sea witch who, you know, is the evil one apparently for making someone sign a contract. I mean, she gave her an out there. And these witches in fairy tales that have been adapted to the screen, a lot of the time they don't actually have any magical abilities, like the witch in Hansel and Gretel. You never actually hear of her making any potions or casting any spells or flying on a broom. She's just this old woman living in maybe a magical house. I mean, it would take a lot to build a gingerbread house.
Yeah.
But merely the fact that she was an old woman is that she was a witch and she would eat the children. So that's definitely another trend that comes up in these films. And then we have the housewife witch, which started with, I believe it was I Married a Witch from 1942. You've got these gorgeous woman who is a witch and her own person, and then she kind of settles down a bit and lets go of those abilities, and she is no longer a witch, which follows up with Bell, Book and Candle. When she falls in love, she loses her powers. And of course, the TV series Bewitched from the 60s, she tries to ignore her witchy ways and just wants to be a normal housewife. So it's almost like they're taking the witch out of them when they settle down into their normal lives and try and be these normal people. There is a book called Bell, Book and Camera, I believe it is, or by Heather Green. And she studies that a lot. It's almost like many of these films are taking this wild woman, and then when they are, like you said, domesticated, they lose their power in a way, more ways than one.
It's interesting. I mean, if you think about the 40s through the 60s, this is the time period when Western culture is domesticating everybody, right? It's post-World War II, or we're working into that post-World War II era through the 60s. Like, that's the tame era until the late 60s, where we took all our clothes off and painted ourselves in day glow. But that was the reaction. So, I mean, Bewitched sort of straddles that history, right? The show itself.
It does, yes. And I've only recently watched, I think, the first couple of seasons of Bewitched. And, you know, no matter what she does, though, she always seems to have to resort back to witchcraft. Well, her little powers of wiggling her nose and making things happen, which is, you know, she ends up having to be herself, which is a different message you could get out of it.
That she can't be domesticated. Poor Darren.
Exactly. It's so funny with those episodes. You can, because they're all written by different people, and some of them are quite forward-thinking for their time, and usually those are the episodes that were written by women. And then one will come in and then just make her the housewife again. And most often those are written by men.
And of course, the mother-in-law, right, provides this counterfoil. She's the, you know, Agnes Moorehead is the draw of the whole show, stealing the scene every time she comes in. So yeah, right.
Yep, that's her witchy ways coming back.
Yeah, she's unapologetic, right, about the whole witch business. So how does that get us to like let's just hang with the, I don't want to get lost in the sauce, right? But so you're identifying all of these. I mean, Sabrina then would be our modern Bewitched. She remains a domesticated figure, but now she's a teenager, and the Sabrina plot and the Bewitched plot are very similar, right? There's this witch world that keeps showing up in our regular world, and she's just trying to go to school.
Yes. That's another one that's, they've got to hide who they really are. And there are very few series that actually have people living openly as witches. It's always got to be a secret. You've got the Charmed ones, you've got Sabrina, and of course Bewitched, and they've got to hide who they are. But usually when it does come to light that they're witches, people are very accepting of the fact. I mean, as much as they can be when they find out magic and flying things are real.
They're okay with it.
Yeah. So, just be who you are, and the people around you who really love you will accept you.
So what is the difference between that kind of attitude and something like Shirley Jackson? Didn't you do, what is the name of that movie? We've Always Lived in This House. Is that the movie?
Oh, I love that film.
So how do we contrast it, though? I mean, in that movie, the girls are accused, or both of the girls are accused of witchcraft, and it's they're ostracized for it. They're known as witches, and it's no good.
Yes, and that's where your like horror witch comes in, where you've got that was like starting with The Undead from 1950, or even Black Sunday 1960s, and then Rosemary's Baby also in the 60s. They're these again bringing on the trope of the evil child consuming witch, or someone who wants to stay immortal, and that even comes back down to a lot of fairy tales with the immortal witch. I think Rapunzel is one of them, and it does have that contrast, and they are not accepted into society because they are using these powers for evil, as it were. And I think the horror witch, you don't usually see them doing much with their abilities as witches. It's because they're evil, and sometimes a woman, that makes them just be called the title of witch, even though you never actually see them a lot of the time practicing any kind of witchcraft, because that's what a witch is. It's someone who practices witchcraft, but it's the title is just kind of tacked on, I find, in horror movies especially, is if it's a woman with some kind of evil ability, they kind of just chuck witch on there. They sometimes without even any backstory as to how perhaps they became a witch. And it's just, I feel like it's a very weak writing sometimes for just going, yep, they're a witch because they're a bad person.
Yeah, so just adding it on because it's easy.
Yeah, no actual villain building. They just kind of go, oh, they're bad because they're a witch. And that goes all the way back to, the association of witches and the devil, or this satanic panic even, is where a lot of that resurfaced when through the 70s and 80s, when Wicca was actually becoming more of a mainstream, as much as it could be at the time, religion, and people would then just associate that with the devil again, even though it was just misunderstood. It was something new that people were finding freedom in. Rob, you mentioned people in the 60s and 70s just taking their clothes off again, and that's where the title of witch actually started being, rather than pinned onto someone, being claimed by someone.
But a challenge to the family, nevertheless, to domesticity.
Yes, yeah. It was kind of, yes, I am a witch, and I'm going to claim that title and be that person, and I guess try and go against the norm of what was happening and be a part of something else. And Wicca is another one of those kind of, is brought up quite a lot, but incorrectly as well.
You talk about that.
Yeah, so of course, people think of Wicca as this ancient religion when really it was Gerald Gardner in, I think it was the 1940s or 50s, was when he wrote about that and started introducing people to this ancient religion, which was really just him taking bits and pieces of older pagan, quotation marks, religions and kind of meshing them into one and calling it Wicca. And then Wicca became associated with witch, whereas they are two different things, and even not all Wiccans identify as witches. But it's something that has kind of been synonymous, especially in pop culture, where they go, oh, they're a witch, so there must be Wiccan. Even in Charmed, they mention being Wiccan, even though you see absolutely nothing in there, except, I guess, part of that is the rule of 3, but not everyone follows that, which is, what you put out in the world, you get back times 3, and there is the 3 charmed ones, and 3 is the number that comes up a lot in pop culture when it comes to witches. Sabrina the Teenage Witch, it was her and her 2 aunties, the 3 charmed ones. You had the 3 sisters from Hocus Pocus. 3 is something that comes up quite a lot. And I think that comes from, 2 is just a couple of people hanging out together, whereas 3 is a coven. So we've got to have a little tiebreaker there to make them a force to be reckoned with, I guess.
So what did practical magic, how did that cook that up?
So that's so practical magic and the craft both had 4, I guess. Yeah. So, but they saw that more as the 4 elements, which is also associated with witchcraft: earth, air, fire, water. The craft took those elements and represented them by 4 people, and then it was remade. Don't want to talk about that one.
I mean, the craft is interesting because it's almost like they want to go back to 3. Like 4 is too many, though, right?
Yeah, you're right. They start in that 3, and then a 4th is brought in. But you don't actually. It's like she was a catalyst for their abilities, because you don't actually see them possess any kind of ability until this 4th is brought in. And there is a theory that the power was just from Sarah, and she kind of shared it with the rest of them, which is why they lose their abilities at the end, whereas she keeps hers. And again, the craft, that was my first video that I did for Witch Way. Of course, I look a bit back on that one and cringe, because you're always going to with the very first thing that you do. But I've grown so much since then. And again, I see some things in the craft video that I go, oh, I could have talked about this, or I missed that. And that was definitely, I think, a film that a lot of people resonated with in the 90s. Because, Wicca was a massive thing in the 90s. I even remember after watching The Craft going and getting some books on witchcraft, but they were not what I was expecting. Very much sounded more like self-help with a couple of extra steps in there. Yeah, not quite what I was looking for. And a lot of people...
Very personal.
Yeah, a lot of people do... assume that I do practice witchcraft because I am so interested in these topics, but I don't. It's not something that I need right now, or might later. You never know where things are going to take you. But I do try and approach the practice of witchcraft in a respectful manner, because I know it is a big part of many people's lives.
So, I mean, let's drill into that a little bit. I mean, you say on your show more than once that you're not a practicing witch. So then what does this do for you? What does it do for an audience?
Yes.
I mean, I'm not a Wiccan, right? But I enjoy them. Like, what is it? What are we trying to get out of the pop culture, the analysis of the pop culture of the witch? What are you getting out of that work?
Well, I feel like I've always very much resounded with these figures that I've seen in film. I always thought that even from cartoons that I watched as a child, that this powerful female figure who looks badass in what they're wearing, I thought they were so much cooler than our, say, princess protagonist. You've got Ursula the Sea Witch. She is like, boss bitch, making a living, but some people couldn't fulfill their end of the bargain. Even the evil queen looks fabulous and yes, practices the mysterious dark arts. And I feel like those kind of figures were the only powerful women that you really saw in that kind of media. It's just they made some poor decisions.
So they're icons of feminine empowerment.
Yeah, I think that is part of it. And that is usually where you saw these powerful women, was in these portrayals of witches. But it's almost like that was then demonized because they used this power. They couldn't control this power, and it ultimately led to their downfall. And I just think, couldn't we have someone who used that to benefit themselves and others? And that's kind of where the other films come into it that do portray witches like that, like Practical Magic. That is one that resounded with many, many people because they used those abilities and they were just normal people until something happens and then they have to then use those powers. But then they do come together at the end. They find that's another element. If they're not demonized, they then come together as a sisterhood and do empower each other. So we are seeing that kind of change in the witch, to this one solo evil woman to a coven of people coming together to support each other, which is the one thing I can say was good about the new craft, is they were very supportive of each other.
Yeah, Practical Magic and the craft are sort of like an argument, right?
Yes, yeah. Again, 4 and 4, and one of them breaks down and falls apart, and the other one are closer than ever at the end. And I feel like not practicing witchcraft, I can be kind of just a non-biased viewer in what's happening in these films, and it then doesn't make me go, no, that's not how it's done, because I don't really know how it's done, because I'm I guess a self-proclaimed armchair occultist or armchair witch, because I study these things but I've never actually practiced them. But I have had, yes, a lot of comments saying, oh, what's your practice like? Or even some of the more negative comments who... You're always going to have those who just assume you're in league with the devil. Or, yeah, those comments. I've had quite a few of them.
I mean, I've
on my
tried
videos.
to be in leagues with him. I keep giving him my number and calling him, and he just never answers.
So, yeah, those comments seem to just come out of nowhere. Some of them aren't even referencing anything I've mentioned in my videos, and then they just jump to this assumption that, Satanism and witchcraft, they're terrible things. And I usually like to just throw back that the Satanic Temple aren't actually Satan worshippers. They just use it as a loophole.
But you're fairly neutral when you present these things. You're like, no, this is the book that the book that has demons in it, but you don't do any value judgment and sort of academic in that way, like our show, like we try to do at our best. So maybe that's probably the problem.
Yeah, maybe they just kind of, because I'm presenting these topics, they assume that I must be associated negatively with them. But I think it's, I love that people can find power in these practices, and that it is such a eclectic practice that each person does things differently. And I think it's, I think it's really awesome that people can find comfort in that and power as well. It's just not something that I myself practice. So it is something I do try and come at in a neutral manner. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that. I mean, of course, I'm not a partisan for any of these things we talk about on the show, but we will get comments sometimes like you should have really had, I don't know, a theosophist sitting with you in this discussion, and I honor that. That's fine. But I really wouldn't, because they would be busy correcting me based on their dogma and their lore, which they believe in, rather than looking at it from the objective standpoint of, what can we believe? What can we believe and what shouldn't we believe? I mean, Blavatsky can do no wrong. That's not true. Of course, she did some wrong. I love her, but she's not perfect. But you can only say that if you're not in the club. You know
yes,
what I mean?
And I'm not going to go trying to make assumptions out of what people did hundreds of years ago. I can, of course, look at these horrible things that were done to people in witch trials and like torture, and these all done in fear, I guess. Again, I can't make those assumptions because I wasn't there. All I can do is read this biased content that was created by someone who just hated everything that they thought the witch was, that this evil being that, again, wasn't always women. Men were also accused of witchcraft. Children were executed alongside, and it's still happening in parts of the world today. It's not even a thing of the past. There are films that do still address that. In some parts of Africa, there are a couple of films that portray what's still going on there, such as War Witch and I Am Not a Witch. That these people have been demonized and exiled from their communities and have to live in these government-funded villages that aren't fully protected, unfortunately. So it's not even a thing of the past. And I think it is quite a privilege for us or people to be able to call themselves a witch without having, their lives destroyed, because witch still holds a negative connotation in many parts of the world.
Getting back to our chronology here, cross time, I mean, 1400 on, there's this negative stereotype. Suddenly in 1940, we have the domesticated witch, and she's cool, and we can hang out with her, but she's always sort of trying to bust out of her shell. Now, the 70s, you talk about Rosemary's Baby. You start to reintroduce, like, the domesticated witch is maybe we need to get a little suspicious of her. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and there is Season of the Witch that takes both of those together, She is that domesticated housewife, but she starts like that, and then she ends up overwhelmed with what she thought she could do. And that was a very... it kind of turned that idea on its head, because, that film was interesting. It did take those elements of Wicca as well, in the fact that that she was initiated into this coven and found her power, but then she ultimately falls because of it. So again, she almost finds her power back, and then it's her own downfall, which is another common trope. And you mentioned between the era of, the 1400s to the 17th, was it the 14th century to 17th century was when witches were demonized. And then you kind of come into the era of spiritualism as well, which I also find fascinating. It's almost like that was the median ground between the demonized witch to then reaching out to the beyond, and that being okay because it was kind of giving you some kind of closure, because it happened at a time when a lot of people were experiencing loss from different wars that were happening at the time. So then they kind of grasped onto that as a coping mechanism of dealing with grief. And I feel like that is the kind of boundary that pushed it in a different direction, as well as the occult societies that popped up, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, that kind of made it more of a scholarly, I guess. It kind of changed it from this heathen pagan to this academic who was just studying the occult and then practicing it. And it was almost for the rich. You know, you had to have access to this literature in order to study magic. And I find, the spiritualism era was pretty wild in what some people were doing in order to make a buck off of people who were dealing from grief as well. You have Helen Duncan was the last person to be jailed as part of the Witchcraft Act because she was found to be a false medium who was using cheesecloth as ectoplasm. And the lengths that people would go to, it's just wild.
Yeah, I mean, right there, that 19th century medium is like, I guess it's a kind of pop culture, which I hadn't thought about my mediums that way, that I've spent so much time studying, but I think that's true. They were very pop culture in contrast to what would then happen with the Golden Dawn and the ceremonial magicians, all those guys. But the mediums, in contrast, they brought it to the masses.
Yeah, and Penny Dreadful is a series that focuses on mediumship and in the second season Witchcraft as well, and kind of brings them together. And I loved how they meshed the two together. It's a fantastic series.
Yeah, the title referring to a popular form of storytelling that I don't know if it would have gotten into so much, supernaturalism, like actual penny dreadfuls, but I get the idea.
I did look into it a little bit, and it was more, of course, your monsters like your vampires and werewolves that were in penny dreadfuls, not too many about witches and spiritualism, though that would have been amazing. None that I was able to find anyway.
And the plot of that show sort of starts off in that direction with the we don't give it away, but...
It does, yeah.
So
great show.
So we move into the 80s, Satanic Panic. Is that the movie world, the TV world? Are they turning against the witch in this era?
I feel like in the 70s it kind of brought out the sexualization of the witch. You have films that The Devils, it was just naked bodies everywhere. You have the sexploitation films, which then did use witches as their plot lines in there. But again, you had Suspiria as well. Is that kicked off kind of I brought back the horror witch, I guess, a little bit as well. But it in the 70s and 80s, I feel like witches were more referred to as sorcerers and sorceresses. That the 80s is when the fantasy element really started to come through. They weren't witches anymore. They were wizards and enchanters and enchantresses and sorcerers and sorceresses. And it wasn't towards the end of the 80s that the classic witch came back, but it was in more of a fun way, I guess, because in the late 80s you got The Little Mermaid, which had Ursula in it. You had Teen Witch, which was a interesting one, very Sabrina, because on her 16th birthday she found out she was a witch. You have The Witches of Eastwick, which I was expecting much more from that film, and I think I was a little bit let down by the amount of hype. It was one of my most recommended films, and when I watched it I went, what is happening? All these, like, instead of these women getting together, they're just like fawning over this not very attractive or charismatic man. Which, if you don't want a spoiler, just, the end is better. But yeah, so the 80s was a interesting time. I think that's also when Kiki's Delivery Service No, that was a bit later. Yeah, so that's, yeah, it was a very interesting era for that. It kind of brought back the fun element of it. And not long after that was the 90s, where witches just like exploded on screen. You had the Witches, you had Hocus Pocus, you had the Sabrina movie, which then kicked off the series. You had the Crucible, which was based off the Arthur Miller play around the Salem witch trials, Practical Magic, Halloween Town, the Blair Witch Project, Sleepy Hollow, The Craft, and Buffy, which had massive elements of witchcraft in it. And I think that's when it really came to the mainstream and people were practicing it. It wasn't weird to hear that somebody was a witch or a Wiccan. And I think pop culture probably played a big part in that because of all these films.
And it's a fairly sympathetic portrayal by the 90s, right? I mean, Willow and all these characters are not, I mean, eventually, yeah, I mean, there's Dark Willow, but before there's a long stretch where she's just like playing with it and she's got the power and it's all good and it helps and she's just like Thelema on steroids.
And that's actually when your first portrayal of the queer witches came into it as well, which I think was a really big thing for the queer community, because they are also people who have really resonated with the witch. You know, they've claimed back these words to make their own, and that's very similar to people who are practicing witchcraft claiming that word back and being able to call themselves a witch.
But now at least Ursula was definitely queer coded, was she not?
Oh yeah.
But the 90s is this renaissance or revival of witch culture, essentially. So
very much so.
Looking at it from this pop culture lens, what is, in the sense of like, what is something that's consistent across all these different, like between Sabrina and Buffy, what is like some consistent facets across each one of these that keeps pushing witchcraft further into pop culture?
I feel like after the 90s, they kind of took away that devil character, that overarching figure who would be the source of their power. And from the 90s kind of onwards, it was more that came from yourself. It was something that you could achieve. You didn't have to make this trade in order to find this power. And I feel like that is something that has been taken out, is this devil figure, which was used so much in the past. That's how they got their abilities, and now it's something that they came into on their own. Unfortunately, a lot of them, they're just born witches, which I think is very lazy as well. It's kind of like, yep, I'm a witch. I've always been a witch, which is very, Harry Potter. You're a wizard, Harry. Sabrina, her aunts were witches. A lot of them are just born witches. But I think the ones that do resound more are the ones where they find their own powers. You've got Willow in Buffy. She made that her own. You've got more of the ones that grow up. Even Sabrina, she didn't know she was a witch until her 16th birthday, which seems another common theme. We've got, the Secret Circle, the teen dramas. The Vampire Diaries is another one where they kind of, once they reach that age, this power's like thrust upon them and they have to find a way to then deal with that. And they do, which I think it is a very coming of age story in that account. But yeah, I feel like taking away that devil element is something that has made it more acceptable, I guess. But, you do still have your satanic witches out there, so that's not always the case.
I mean, is it coded for female sexuality in general? And when we think about this, going back to the 70s, right, and the Wicker Man, and there's Christopher Lee lording it over all these naked women running around this island, And there's this idea in the 70s that women have birth control now, but they're going to ruin the house, and they're going to send the kids to daycare and go get jobs, and now we're going to have but then in the 90s, Willow is not only discovering witchcraft, but she's also discovering her sexuality.
Yeah.
16 years old is to me like that's poltergeist time, right? When you're really connecting, but it's because of all those emotions that you're churning up. You're becoming a woman, and becoming a woman means embracing your sexuality in the 90s, maybe in the 2000s more so. So is it tracking that development of us embracing women as sexual beings?
Yeah, I mean, Chilling Adventures of Sabrina really clocks onto that. The series, that when she finds out she's a witch when she's 16. Yes, there is that still the deal with the devil. But after that she has a massive sexual awakening. The school has like orgies and stuff. And you're like, what kind of school do you go to? So I think they really pulled that idea into the show because, yeah, that's a big part of it. And though they made it okay for people, and they did have male and female witches, even though they did the classic, these are witches and these are warlocks. You could just call them both witches. Harry Potter, I'm looking at you. So, yeah, and I feel like they made it okay to have that your own sexuality about you. You can do what you want with it. They didn't have to have monogamous relationships. They could just have fun. And the comparison to that with their own power, I think they did that pretty well on that show. Unfortunately, it did dive towards the end of the series. But yeah, I think that's a really common theme, actually. And again, with there are male witches out there. They're just really hard to find. And the earliest one I could find with a male witch, I guess, but again, they called it a warlock, was the film Warlock from 1989. And he was your classic Satan worshipping, child eating, all powerful witch who had needed someone to stop them as well. So yeah, I just and now the witch is a term that anyone can claim. It's not you have to be a witch or a warlock or a witch or a wizard. It's you can just be a witch, which I think that's.
So tell us more about the men.
Yeah, so these characters have only really popped up here and there. So a majority of them have been female. Female everywhere. It's a witch if it's female, and with power it's a witch. So it is very tricky to get male witches. Of course, you've got Rosemary's Baby. They are technically Satanists, not even really witches. I don't know if that's actually mentioned. You've got I can't remember his name, but he's the leader of the coven. And he is the one who is pulling all the strings. Like you said, you've got the Wicker Man. You've got someone who's leading everyone else in these moments. Usually the man is the witch hunter in a majority of these films, like The Witchfinder General, which tells the story of Matthew Hopkins, a real-life person who was responsible for the death of hundreds, apparently, people who he tested to and said, yes, this person's a witch. And again, they're given those titles of wizard or warlock or sorcerer opposed to this title of witch. And I feel like usually they are more academic. They have to study to get their abilities, whereas the women, it's more of an innate ability that they're able to tap into. I mean, you've got Merlin from Arthurian legend. He was a well-known wizard and sorcerer who was really powerful, but in some tales of the legend, it was a woman who was his downfall with, I think it was Morgan Le Fay, burying him alive after learning his secrets. So this male witch is usually a side character, I guess, until you get to those stories of Merlin, which I love, the 1998 miniseries Merlin with Sam Neill. It's beautiful. Again, though, he's a wizard, you know, and it's not until some of the side characters in like, the Secret Circle, they're like a group of witches together where we have both males and females in a coven, and they're very few and far between that they pop up. So, but I think it is important because, you know, there are people who claim that title who identify as male. So I think having more representation of that in pop culture should be just as important as these empowering female characters who claim the same title. I think the most recent one that I saw that was a male witch was Half Bad, the bastard son of the devil himself, which was a fantastic series. And yeah, he had to deal with just the same things. He was born with this ability, but part of him came from a darker side. So he also had to have his own internal battle and deal with those demons. And it was again, this one was one that was a very much a coming of age story, but it was based around a male character. So I think that was a really important series that people should check out, because again, they don't just have a monogamous relationship. There's a throuple in that one, which is again even broadly widening the scope of people's sometimes narrow views of what is and isn't appropriate for. He was also a 16-year-old, I believe. So yeah, they're very few and far between, but I would like to see more of them.
And are they, I mean, like Harry Potter, right? They're rubbing against like Harry. I understand there's a lot of male witches, but we're meant to care about Harry, and Harry's the only one who has to deal with the fact that he's ostracized in the regular world, right?
Even though somebody commented, I remember that, in the regular world, he is nothing essentially. But when he comes into this legend that is himself, he's essentially a jock. He plays sports. He's, you know, I just went, oh my gosh, my vision of this film has changed forever, because, you know, he's not the nicest person to everyone. And yeah, he just comes from this place of privilege. He has so much money in this world, and there's his friend just, you know, who's grown up in this world, which, you know, just because you're magical doesn't mean you're wealthy and well off, because, you know, his friend Ron just grows up in this ramshackle house, but he's happy there. So that's what, you know, Harry learns. But again, it's the school for witchcraft and wizardry. It could just be the school for witchcraft. You don't have to draw this line in the sand. So
you've got the penis and you go over there.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, because you go all the way back to the witch trials, and they were witches, no matter what gender they were. So it did kind of take them apart in almost every series, and it's only just bringing it back together again. The Owl House, that has, you know, they're all witches. It's a great animated series on Disney that is another coming of age film. And yeah, no matter who you are, you're a witch, doesn't matter. And I think that's becoming more and more relevant. More and more people are just going, yep, witches, doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, you can claim that title as your own, which I think is pretty cool.
It's almost mirroring, and I hate to keep doing this, but the gender, like the new generation, the gender ideology.
Yeah. You can you know, claim whatever title you want as long as you're the one who's claiming it. You don't need these labels put onto you, which is, you know, what you see in a lot of the earlier pop culture. It's like, they're a witch. It's like, yeah, I am a witch, and that's who I am, and that's okay.
So where are we at now that you're sort of pushing us into the present moment? Where are we in the 21st century?
Yeah, I found there hasn't, other than that, it's still about the claiming of power and finding out who you are, but there isn't as much of a trend. You still have those series that do focus on your horror witches, like the Autopsy of Jane Doe, even though that's briefly mentioned. And the series Marianne, where the evil, it's a French series, which is absolutely fantastic. That's the horror witch who's, trying to get what they want. But you do have these other films, the horror witch as well, Fear Street. Oh my gosh, that film trilogy really did well with dealing with both the evil witch and also the scapegoat witch, someone who was given that label. So that one was I can't really say too much about it without spoiling it, because it does have a big twist at the end. But you do have a lot more series, lots more series actually. There hasn't been too many films, so it's like they are trying to discover more about what this witch character is and what makes them who they are. You've got the Motherland, Fort Salem series, which was a very fascinating one because they kind of took this powerful witch character and made the females soldiers. They run the military, and then the male witches are there to kind of support them and raise the families. So that was an interesting one that turned normal gender roles on its head. So it was like the men who were the carers, and the women were the breadwinners, essentially. So that was an interesting way to turn it on its head, because there are more and more men and fathers who choose to stay home with their children. So I thought that was a very modern way of looking at it. Although it did kind of stick to those gender roles, it just swapped them. So yeah. The modern ones, you have quite a few mixes. You do still see those reoccurring themes of the evil witch in Fear Street, and you have The Cabinet of Curiosities by Guillermo del Toro. There was a couple of stories in there with witches. That was your classic horror witch. But then it is bringing in those who are claiming their own power again in Wednesday, the series that took a witchy spin. You've got the Mayfair witches. Domino Day, Solitary Witch, is a very new one where she is, again, trying to figure out who she is and claim her own power. So those themes, changing all the way from the beginning of pop culture. You've got the classic, which I haven't even mentioned, the pointed hat and broomstick portrayal that was very prevalent then. And even the green-skinned witch of The Wizard of Oz, that was the first time green skin was associated with witches. So you've gone from these evil, devil-worshipping witches to all the way through to the modern-day portrayals of, someone trying to reclaim their own power and not having that downfall. Like there was that middle period where they went, yes, I can have this power, but then it destroys them at the end. Whereas these more recent series, they're kind of claiming their power and owning that power and using it like how I wanted my villains in the original to actually use their power to better themselves and make their lives better instead of being their own downfall.
Sure.
It's really kind of come from someone giving them power. It's like the devil giving them power and then them falling because of it, to them claiming their own power and using it in their own ways. So I think it's definitely you still have those themes every now and then because you want a good horror film. So we've got to include some bad witches in there. But I think it's becoming, a lot more of a positive element instead of the negative one that it started off with witches being making pacts with the devil and being burned at the stake, which you also, that's my pet peeve, when you hear about the Salem witch trials and they say, oh, there were witches burned at the stake. No, they were hanged. And that was one thing that I did learn through, because crimes where witchcraft was a crime, that's when they were hanged, whereas when witchcraft was heresy, that was when they were burned. So so many that I just go, oh, Salem witch, they didn't burn witches. The very first adaptation of the Salem witch trials was Rose of Salem Town, and yes, she almost gets burnt at the stake. So, and I think that is something that is used throughout the ages, is this this visual horror of someone getting burned alive, usually as well, which most of the time wasn't the case. They were usually strangled or killed some way beforehand, before then being put on the pyre. But I think that is just an element that has been overused almost, because just the horror of what happened to these people. And that's where a majority of pop culture comes from, is this horror of the, you know, mass witch trials that took place hundreds of years ago, and that how far spread they were, and the brutality of torture and being burned at the stake. And the more I learned about that, the more horrified I was about what happened to these people, whether, you know, they may have done something wrong that they then just said was witchcraft, but no one deserves that, to be tortured until you confess. Yeah. And I mean, who wouldn't say something to make the pain stop? That's, there's the film Aquilare, or Coven, that really showed the horror of the Basque witch trials, and it didn't try and make anything of it. It didn't say, yes, they were witches. It was, this is what happened, this is what they went through to lead to what ultimately happened to them. And I think it was great that they included all of these beliefs that people thought at the time of witches having their Sabbaths and breaking bread with the devil. But they were saying these things to just make it stop.
Yeah, you get to really watch the torture in that movie in a way that I think a lot of movies don't portray, and the degree to which the priest is just creating the story of the witch for them to then confess to.
Yeah, and that's based off a real character, a real historical character, Pierre de Lanca, who wrote on the inconstancy of witches, which he was pretty much saying, witches will lie. So even if they say that they did it, that's a lie. But then if they say they didn't do it, that's them lying because of the devil. And reading this just made me so angry, because he contradicted himself at every turn just because of this strange fascination he had with the witch's Sabbath. So I was struggling to read that one.
The legal downfall of Salem is that they allowed the devil to testify, and then later they looked back on the trials and said, wait a second, the devil always lies. Yeah. Why are we trusting the devil? Oops, too late.
Yeah, they did very much contradict themselves, and there was people involved in those trials who were trying to stop them. So it isn't always just everyone going crazy and saying, oh, there's witches. There are usually people who, you know, it wasn't everyone being, you know, fanatic and, oh, they were so stupid back then. There were people with a voice of reason, but some of them got in trouble too, because they tried to support people who were accused and then themselves end up being being accused of witchcraft. So it was, you really had to put yourself out on a limb, and sometimes that limb broke.
Do you think the media has done a decent job of, I'm going to say, expiating some of our sins here, like in terms of the witch trials? I mean, Bewitched certainly not really doing that work, but as we move forward toward the 2000s and 2010s, are we actually getting up to that work now?
Well, we do see them completely embrace the idea of the devil witch in the Salem series. They just completely went, yes, this happened. They got a lot of elements with the Salem witch trials, but also the European witch trials of, you know, the flying ointment that they used to fly to their Sabbaths, and they just made it if these people's fears were real. So that was like, it was so absurd in a way that it, and the witch as well, it took the nightmares of people and what they thought happened and made them real. But again, in such an absurd way, because what are you going to say when you're being tortured to try and make it stop? You are going to say, yes, I turned into a cat and I attended the Sabbath. And so that was a very interesting way of, making it so absurdly over the top that you thought, oh, there's no way people would believe that. But even early media, Hexen actually, from 1922, that actually portrayed the witch trials, a fictional witch trial of someone who didn't actually do it. They went, this person was sick, they died. This person was accused, they were tortured, they confessed, and they died. So it's not a new thing. I found that people were trying to explain that the witch trials, you know, were real. They actually happened. These people were, horrible things happened to them. So I feel like those ones, though, are very few and far between, saying, yeah, these bad things happened to these people who were accused of witchcraft. And then you have these other ones that were playing on those fears and going, yes, let's make them real. So I feel like the ones that do portray it as something terrible, that and that those people were the victims, I feel like those are very important pieces of media.
I mean, it's strange to think about it. I mean, when I think about like American slavery and these other horrible things that humans did to each other, the genocide of indigenous peoples in Australia, in the United States, in Canada, we would never imagine today creating a movie where we reiterate the stereotypes that were used at the time period to justify those actions, right? And yet the horror movie does. I mean, Salem, like you're saying, we'll go back and
very good point.
Basically re-victimize these people all over again, these normal people who are just living their lives.
Yeah.
To kind of twist it. It's a tricky business.
I think one thing that the Salem series did well, though, is they actually made the accusers the witches. So they did make the accusers the bad guys, and the victims were still the victims. So they were accused. It was their plot was to get all of these innocent people killed by their own fear that they'd seeded throughout the community. So I think that was an interesting way of still making the accusers the ones who are wrong. Yes. And because you don't want to portray those people in a
positive light at all.
Which I don't think they do. Yeah, I don't think they do portray them in a positive light, because any of them inflicting this kind of damage on other people, there's no way you can get them to be right now. But at the time, they did think that. So, I mean, some people, obviously not, but you would hope that these people weren't just inflicting torture on others because they liked it.
Yeah.
It's hard to be in that mindset of where you would have to be to do that to another person.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, please tell us where we can find you.
Yeah, so you can find me on my YouTube channel, Which Way, and on Instagram as Which Way Official. And yeah, feel free to reach out and find me there. I'm more than happy to take requests of which films or series that I can do next. I'm trying to make my way through some currently. So it's always great getting these really different requests that I always try and move them to the top of my list. So if you have a favorite movie out there that you want me to cover, you can leave a comment or hit me up on Instagram.
Yeah, I gotta say, I do vouch for Alyce's work. It's fantastic. I think the videos are really well produced. I think your research is great. I think they're the perfect length too. Like, as a guy who does hour-long episodes, yours are far more palatable for YouTube. And just in general, I think you get to pull out some great stuff in your episodes. So I really want our listeners to go out there and find Witch Way on YouTube and check Alyce out. It's a good time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. It was a wonderful conversation.